On this vote, the yeas are 222 and the nays are 200. The motion is adopted.
The House of Representatives has just delivered one of the biggest bipartisan rebukes of Donald Trump's second term, and it came from inside his own party. In a stunning 231 to 195 vote, 20 Republicans broke ranks to help pass the Protect America's Workforce Act, a bill that overturns Trump's March executive order and restores collective bargaining rights to nearly 1 million federal workers.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Protect America's Workforce Act would overturn President Trump's executive order from March that ended collective bargaining rights for roughly 1 million Americans who work for the federal government. Since the order was made, the administration has ripped up more than 700,000 union contracts. The order was the largest act of union busting in American history, and it left our federal workforce more vulnerable to unfair treatment and political interference. I'm proud that since introducing this bill, it's won the support of 226 of my colleagues in this chamber.
Hey guys, welcome back. Dr. John is here, so this is what just happened, guys. Trump stormed off a live television set, crushing his microphone and ripping off his lapel after being asked about a topic he refused to address. The unprecedented walkout, captured on camera, signaled a president unwilling to face direct questions, even at the cost of his own carefully crafted image of strength. He had just been asked the kinds of questions that any leader should be able to answer without losing their composure. Questions about election fraud claims, questions about fundraising mechanisms tied to his claims that the government is being weaponized against him. Questions about the documented reality of what he said and what he did. And instead of providing answers, instead of engaging with the substance of the challenge, he simply left. He ended the interview. He walked off the set. And in doing so, he revealed something profoundly important about his relationship with accountability that we have seen play out again and again in different settings with different stakes.
This majority includes Democrats and Republicans who recognize that collective bargaining is not a partisan issue. It's about fairness, dignity on the job, and a voice in the workplace. In his order, President Trump said ending collective bargaining was about protecting our national defense. But in my district and many others, affected workers build our warships and care for our veterans. These workers make our country safer and stronger every single day. America didn't vote to silence these workers, but this bill gives all of us a chance to restore their voices. Every one of us in this body was sent here by our constituents to represent their voice in Congress. While the majority leadership has broad prerogative to set the calendar and control the flow of legislation, no one here believes they should have absolute power to determine which bills see the light of day and which don't. The discharge petition process exists to give members of Congress some agency. It's a release valve to ensure that good bills with broad support cannot be held up forever by a leadership team.
The scene unfolded on NBC's Meet the Press, one of the most respected and long-running political interview programs in American television. The host pressed Trump with repeated, challenging questions about his continued claims that the 2020 election was stolen. The host pressed about the specific fundraising vehicle Trump has been using to raise money based on those claims. The host pressed about what Trump calls the weaponization of government, asking whether there is any factual basis for the allegations he has been making to his supporters. The line of questioning was direct, persistent, and grounded in documented facts. And Trump's response was not to defend his claims, not to provide evidence, not to engage in a substantive debate about the issues. His response was to end the conversation entirely. Let's call it quits. I've had enough. Crush the microphone. Leave.
It gives us a fair shot at building a coalition to do the people's work and get an up or down vote on the floor. That's exactly how my colleagues and I have spent the past several months. We've built a bipartisan coalition representing a majority of the House in support of this bill and done the work to bring it to the floor. I know that none of us ran for office with a vision of governing by discharge petition. Most of us long for the return of regular order, where bills are assessed in committee, seriously debated, and given a vote. But here we are. As it stands, we must use every tool available to do the people's work. I'm grateful to my 8 Republican colleagues who co-sponsored the bill, led by my friend Congressman Brian Fitzpatrick of Pennsylvania, and to the 5 Republicans who signed the discharge petition to ensure that this chamber would hold this vote. If the majority we built over the past few months sticks together, We can overturn this union-busting executive order, and we can show America that this body will protect workers' rights.
But here is the thing that makes this story so much bigger than one interview on one network. This is not an isolated incident. There is a pattern. There is a documented behavioral signature that has been observed in multiple high-stakes settings where Trump has been confronted with sustained, challenging questions that he cannot easily dismiss or redirect. The Supreme Court hearing where he walked out when the questioning turned against his lawyers. The various press conferences where he has abruptly ended sessions when the questions became too pointed. The pattern is consistent and unmistakable. When Trump is pressed in live public settings with the kinds of accountability questions whose honest answers are most directly relevant to the specific legal and constitutional challenges he faces, his response is to end the challenge rather than engage it.
I urge my colleagues to vote yes on the rule. Let these workers have their day on the House floor. Give them an up or down vote. They deserve that much. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
For months, the Trump administration had been stripping away union protections, canceling contracts for 700,000 employees, and pushing what labor leaders called the largest federal union-busting effort in modern U.S. history. But this time, Congress fought back.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of H.R. 2550, bipartisan legislation to restore collective bargaining rights for hundreds of thousands of unionized federal employees. This legislation reaffirms a core principle. A government that serves the people must also respect the rights of those who serve within it. Federal employees work tirelessly every day, often behind the scenes. They process Social Security benefits, safeguard our food, safeguard our water, care for our veterans, and respond whenever a disaster strikes. Their work is essential, and its impact reaches every community across this nation.
And that behavioral pattern is exactly what makes the headline scenario so dramatically compelling and so plausibly grounded in documented reality. Imagine what would happen if, in addition to the NBC host pressing Trump on his election claims, a sitting Secretary of Defense looked him in the eye on live television and called him a criminal. The combination of the documented storm-out behavior and the documented accountability rebukes from the defense community is what gives the headline its specific and alarming power, because we already know how Trump responds when he is challenged in live public settings. And we already know what senior defense officials have said about Trump's conduct when they have assessed it from their positions of institutional authority. The former Secretary of Defense, James Mattis.
Mr. Speaker, by restoring their collective bargaining rights, we strengthen a system that keeps government effective, stable, and responsive, all without compromising security or mission readiness. Reinstating these rights is not a concession, it is a commitment to treat federal workers with dignity, to reinforce a resilient public service, and to honor the commitment of the men and women who show up for the American people every single day. I urge my colleagues to support this bill. I want to thank my friend and colleague from Maine, Jared Golden, for his partnership and, more importantly, for his courage in advancing this initiative. And I yield back the balance of my time.
The bill reached the floor through a rare discharge petition, bypassing GOP leadership entirely. Its bipartisan sponsors, Democrat Jared Golden and Republican Brian Fitzpatrick, argued that supporting workers wasn't a partisan issue, it was a promise. Labor groups hailed the vote as a major victory.
Issued an extraordinary public statement during Trump's first term that stands as one of the most significant official rebukes of a sitting president by a senior military figure in American history. Mattis, a four-star Marine Corps general who had served as the Secretary of Defense under Trump, accused Trump of dividing the country, abusing executive authority, and making a mockery of the Constitution. Those are not words that someone of Mattis's stature uses casually. Those are not political sound bites. That is a constitutional judgment delivered by a person whose entire career was built on defending the very document he was accusing Trump of mocking. Mattis did not use the word criminal in that statement, but the language he used carries the specific constitutional gravity that makes the criminal framing most accurately reach toward. Mockery of the Constitution, abuse of executive authority, deliberate effort to divide the American people. When someone with Mattis's career, a four-star general, a combatant commander, a Secretary of Defense who had personally administered the constitutional oath that the conduct he was describing was violating, uses language like that. It carries enormous institutional weight. He was not making a political statement. He was making the specific institutional accountability judgment that his career most directly authorizes him to make. The judgment of a person who has spent their professional life in service of the constitutional design, whose violation they are now formally assessing and publicly documenting. Then there is the former acting Secretary of Defense, Chris Miller. Miller served in that role during the period immediately surrounding January 6th, and in public interviews, he made a specific acknowledgement that has profound legal and constitutional implications. Miller said there was cause and effect between Trump's words on January 6th and the attack on the Capitol. He placed Trump's speech directly in causal relationship with the violence that followed. Miller also did not use the word criminal in that interview, but the cause and effect characterization is the specific factual determination that most directly supports the specific criminal legal theory that Trump's speech incited the specific attack, that his conduct created the specific causal conditions for the specific violence that followed, and that the legal standards for incitement or for depraved indifference to the foreseeable consequences of specific conduct were met. Section 2. The defense and military community's accountability rebukes represent something profoundly significant in the constitutional story of the Trump era. The civil-military relationship is one of the most fundamental constitutional arrangements in the American system. The principle that the military is subordinate to civilian authority, and that civilian authority is in turn bound by the constitutional constraints that the military's own oath commits it to defend. When the most senior officers of the American military make the specific public accountability judgments that Mattis and Miller and others made about Trump's conduct, they are exercising the specific constitutional duty of their oath, the duty to the Constitution that their oath places above any personal or political loyalty to the specific person who holds the presidential office at any given moment. That duty is not the duty to the president. It is the duty to the Constitution against which the president's conduct must be assessed. Mattis's mockery of the Constitution characterization is the specific military accountability judgment that most directly establishes that duty in its most formal and most publicly documented form. The specific assessment that the specific presidential conduct being described was incompatible with the constitutional obligation that both the military and the president swore to defend. And the fictional scenario in which the current Secretary of Defense makes the same accountability judgment in a live public confrontation is the fictional dramatization of what that constitutional duty would look like if it were exercised in the most immediate and most confrontational setting available. The current Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, has not called Trump a criminal. The public reporting on Hegseth focuses on his own controversies, the specific conduct issues, the investigations into his own behavior, the questions about his fitness for the role, rather than on any accountability judgment he has made about Trump's conduct. Hegseth was appointed specifically as a loyalist, whose commitment to Trump's vision of the defense establishment was the primary qualification Trump valued in his selection. The current Secretary of Defense calling Trump a criminal in a public setting is therefore the specific scenario whose fictional quality is most precisely the opposite of the documented dynamic of the current civil-military relationship. A dynamic that is characterized by the deliberate selection of loyalist leadership and the specific removal of officials who exhibited the institutional independence that produced the Mattis statement and the Miller cause and effect acknowledgement. The criminal accusation from the Secretary of Defense in the headline is the fictional accountability version of the documented reality in which the Secretary of Defense was appointed specifically to prevent that form of accountability from occurring. That irony is the core of what makes the story so alarming. The constitutional design of civilian control of the military is supposed to be balanced by the military's specific institutional commitment to the Constitution rather than to any individual political figure. When the appointment of a Secretary of Defense is based primarily on personal loyalty to the specific president rather than on the specific professional qualifications and the specific institutional independence that the constitutional design of the role most directly requires, the principle that the oath is to the Constitution rather than to any individual is the principle that the appointment process itself most directly challenges. The fictional criminal accusation from the current Secretary of Defense is the most dramatic possible expression of what that constitutional principle would look like if it were exercised in its most immediate and most confrontational form by an official who took the constitutional obligation of the oath more seriously than the personal political loyalty the appointment was based on. The storm out that the headline imagines is the specific behavioral response that the documented pattern of Trump's live public confrontations most directly suggest would follow from a defense secretary of equivalent stature delivering that assessment directly and publicly in a face-to-face setting where the confrontation could not be dismissed as a media statement made at a safe distance from the person being assessed. The specific weaponization fund controversy that was at the center of the NBC Meet the Press storm out is worth examining carefully for what it reveals about the specific accountability territory that the sustained press on Trump in live settings is most reliably entering and why that territory produces the specific storm out response. The weaponization fund is the specific fundraising vehicle tied to Trump's characterization of the justice system's accountability efforts as political weaponization. It is the specific political instrument through which Trump has been raising money from the claim that the accountability proceedings against him are not legitimate legal processes but partisan political attacks. The NBC host pressed on that specific vehicle. The repeated questioning about the specific claims being made to raise money through that specific instrument was pressing on the specific territory of whether the claims have factual support and whether the specific fundraising mechanism is accurately representing what the legal proceedings actually are. That specific territory, the accuracy of the claims being made for political and fundraising purposes, is the accountability terrain where the honest engagement with the facts most directly challenges the specific narrative being deployed. And the storm out is the specific response to that challenge that the documented pattern most reliably predicts. The broader pattern of how former defense secretaries have described Trump's conduct, the specific language they have used, the specific constitutional concerns they have articulated, and the specific institutional authority their backgrounds give to their specific assessments is the documented accountability record of the defense community that the current secretary calling him criminal headline is most accurately describing in its most dramatically immediate fictional form. Four-star generals and former secretaries of defense do not use language like mockery of the Constitution and abuse of executive authority casually or without the specific institutional gravity their specific careers and roles have given them. The specific language they have used is the language of people who have spent their professional lives in service of the constitutional design and who are now judging specific presidential conduct against the standards of the Constitution they swore to defend. Their specific expertise in the relationship between civilian authority and military service, their specific first-hand experience of the constitutional oath's demands in the most consequential possible context gives their specific accountability judgments the most authoritative possible grounding in the specific domain of constitutional obligations that they are assessing. Mattis served under Trump and then made his specific judgment. Miller made his cause and effect acknowledgement from the specific vantage point of having served as acting Secretary of Defense in the period immediately surrounding January 6th. The former chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Mark Milley, made documented concerns about Trump's post-January 6th intentions regarding military force. Those concerns represent the specific professional assessment of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs in the specific moment when the most serious questions about civilian control of the military were most acutely relevant to his specific institutional responsibilities. Together, those former and serving defense community officials have produced the most comprehensive insider accountability record of how the specific conduct of the Trump presidency was assessed by the people in the specific professional positions most directly responsible for the constitutional relationship between the presidency and the military. Their public statements are the distributed documentary version of the confrontation the headline is imagining, and the criminal label that the headline attributes to the fictional defense secretary is the legal language equivalent of the constitutional language those former secretaries have actually used in written statements, in media interviews, and in formal public rebukes to describe the conduct they were assessing. The constitutional concerns about Trump's relationship with the military and the rule of law are not new. They have been building building for years. The documented record includes not just the statements from former defense officials, but also the pattern of presidential attacks on the independence of the judiciary and the DOJ. The documented relationship between Trump's rhetoric about judges, law enforcement officials, and political opponents, and the subsequent documented threats and harassment those officials receive, is the specific constitutional context in which the most serious accountability concerns are grounded. The scenario in the headline combines the documented storm-out behavior and the documented defense community accountability judgments into their most dramatically immediate confrontation. What if the current Secretary of Defense said publicly what the former Secretaries of Defense have been saying? And what if Trump responded the way he has been responding to challenges in live public settings? The fictional confrontation is as alarming as the real elements it combines and more immediately visceral in its dramatized form. The Mattis statement, the 2020 extraordinary public rebuke in which the former Secretary of Defense accused Trump of dividing the country, abusing executive authority, and making a mockery of the Constitution, is the specific documented piece of the accountability record from within the defense community that most directly establishes the criminal label's most accurate accountability grounding. The Chris Miller cause and effect acknowledgement, the former acting Secretary of Defense saying there was cause and effect between Trump's words and the January 6th Capitol attack, is the specific piece of the national security and defense community's accountability record that most directly addresses the specific causal connection between Trump's public statements and the specific events of January 6th. Former defense officials making the cause and effect determination in public interviews is the national security and defense community's version of the criminal accusation the headline is imagining coming from the current Secretary of Defense in a live public confrontation. The same accountability judgment, the same causal determination delivered through the formal channel of a media interview rather than in the live confrontational setting the headline imagines. The specific Pete Hegseth dimension of the current Secretary of Defense story is the specific element that most directly establishes the distance between the fictional scenario the headline describes and the documented reality of the current civil-military relationship under Trump. Hegseth has not called Trump a criminal. The public reporting on Hegseth focuses on his own controversies, the specific conduct issues, the investigations into his own behavior, the questions about his fitness for the role, rather than on any accountability judgment he has made about Trump's conduct. The current Secretary of Defense calling Trump a criminal in a public setting is therefore the specific scenario whose fictional quality is most precisely the opposite of the documented dynamic of the current civil-military relationship. A dynamic that is characterized by the deliberate selection of loyalist leadership and the specific removal of officials who exhibited the institutional independence that produced the Mattis statement and the Miller cause and effect acknowledgement. The specific question of what the current civil-military relationship, the Hegseth appointment, the specific loyalist orientation of the current defense leadership means for the constitutional principle of military independence from political loyalty is the most directly alarming dimension of the criminal accusation from the Secretary of Defense scenario and the one that gives the fictional scenario its most serious constitutional grounding. The constitutional design of civilian control of the military is supposed to be balanced by the military's specific institutional commitment to the Constitution rather than to any individual political figure. The specific principle that a Secretary of Defense swears an oath to the Constitution, not to the president who appointed them, is the principle that the appointment process itself most directly challenges. The fictional criminal accusation in the headline is the most dramatic possible expression of what that constitutional principle would look like if it were exercised in its most immediate and most confrontational form by an official who took the constitutional obligation of the oath more seriously than the personal political loyalty the appointment was based on. The documented pattern of presidential attacks on specific named officials being followed by documented harassment campaigns directed at those officials is specific real-world evidence that the most dramatic fictional confrontations the content ecosystem imagines are reaching toward a genuine constitutional alarm that the documented reality most directly supports. The criminal accusation from the Secretary of Defense would, in the specific documented environment of the Trump era, produce specific and predictable consequences for the official who made it. And the fictional scenario is most accurate as a description of the constitutional risk involved in the specific institutional independence the scenario imagines. So what does the full picture of the documented stormouts, the former Secretary of Defense rebukes, the current civil-military relationship, and the specific constitutional questions about presidential accountability mean for the accountability story? The first thing to understand is that the specific elements the headline combines, the storm-out behavior and the defense community criminal accountability judgment, are both documented in real-world instances that are as alarming as the fictional combination the headline imagines, and that together tell the specific accountability story the fictional confrontation is most accurately dramatizing. The NBC stormout is documented in specific detail. The crushed microphone, the let's call it quits, the departure from the set when the press on the election fraud claims reached the specific threshold that the documented behavioral pattern most reliably produces. The maddest mockery of the Constitution is documented in the extraordinary statement whose language is as serious as any public accountability judgment the legal and constitutional vocabulary provides. The Miller cause and effect acknowledgement is documented in the specific interview where the former acting Secretary of Defense placed Trump's speech in direct causal relationship with the Capitol attack. The Milley concerns are documented in the specific reporting that described the chairman of the Joint Chiefs assessment of Trump's post-January 6th intentions. Each of those documented elements is in its specific form as consequential and as constitutionally serious as the headline's fictional combination suggests. The fictional combination is the dramatically immediate version, the single confrontational scene that compresses all of those elements into their most viscerally immediate and most cinematically impactful form. The documented elements are the distributed, accumulated, institutionally grounded version, the slower and more formally credentialed account of the same constitutional accountability that the fictional confrontation imagines in its most compressed expression. And the accountability story of what those distributed, documented elements mean when understood together is as alarming as any single dramatic confrontation the headline could imagine to describe them. The second thing to understand is the specific irony of the current civil-military relationship. The appointment of Hegseth as a loyalist rather than an institutionally independent Secretary of Defense, and what it means for the constitutional principle the fictional criminal accusation scenario is most directly dramatizing. The fictional scenario requires a Secretary of Defense who takes the constitutional oath more seriously than the personal political loyalty the appointment was based on. The current documented reality is the deliberate construction of a civil-military relationship that is oriented toward personal political loyalty rather than institutional constitutional independence. That specific documented inversion, the replacement of the institutional independence that produced the Mattis statement with the personal loyalty that produced the Hegseth appointment, is itself the accountability story that the fictional criminal accusation from the current Secretary of Defense is most accurately dramatizing by contrast. The third thing to understand is the specific content opportunity that the Trump storms out after being called criminal by his own Secretary of Defense framing creates for honest and consequential accountability content. The drama of the fictional confrontation draws an audience. The documented reality of the NBC stormout, the Mattis extraordinary statement, the Miller cause and effect acknowledgement, and the current civil-military relationship's specific loyalist orientation is the documented substance that honest accountability content can deliver to that audience. Content that uses the fictional confrontation as a hook and then explains what has actually happened, the documented stormouts, the documented defense community rebukes, the specific constitutional questions about civilian control of the military and presidential accountability for January 6th, and the specific significance of the Hegseth appointment for the institutional independence the fictional scenario requires, is content that serves both the audience's appetite for the dramatic accountability story and their genuine interest in understanding the documented accountability dynamics the story is most accurately reaching toward. ignored. What the Trump storms out after being called criminal by his own Secretary of Defense framing ultimately captures is the specific quality of the accumulated accountability confrontation between the constitutional obligations of the defense and military community and the specific conduct of the Trump presidency. The documented rebukes from former secretaries of defense and the documented storm-out behavior from live challenging settings most accurately describe the distributed real-world forms of a constitutional crisis that the fictional confrontation dramatizes in its most immediately alarming form. The storm out is documented. The mockery of the Constitution characterization is documented. The cause and effect acknowledgement is documented. The fictional combination of those elements into a single dramatic confrontation between a sitting Secretary of Defense and the President is the content ecosystem's most immediately alarming compression of the accountability story. The distributed documented elements are telling the same story, and the criminal label that the fictional Secretary of Defense delivers in the headline is the legal language equivalent of the constitutional language that the former secretaries of defense have used to describe the specific conduct they assess as incompatible with the constitutional obligations of the office Trump holds. The confrontation happened. It was distributed across multiple documented settings, and the accountability it represents is as serious as any single dramatic scenario the headline could imagine to describe it. The storm out is the behavioral record. The mockery of the Constitution is the accountability record, and together they are building the constitutional story that the fictional confrontation between a sitting Secretary of Defense and the President is most urgently trying to tell.